In today's video, you will hear some creepy supernatural experience from people who don't believe in these stuff. If you like my content, do like and subscribe. I am creating content to try to raise funds for my dad's treatment. So if you want to support his ongoing battle, the GoFundMe link is in the description section below. Thank you so much for being here. And now, let's get started. Story 1. I live in the north of Switzerland. We have a lot of old military bunkers from the Second World War. When I was 7 or 8 years old, 3 friends and I went out to explore one of these bunkers, which was built on a hill inside a small forest. The main door was jammed, so we had to try to break it open. We found a big log nearby and used it as a battering ram. After many tries, the door wouldn't budge, but there was a peephole about 10 centimeters, 4 inches in diameter. We opened it and shined a light into the dark interior. Inside, we saw a long, ruined, and dark hallway with rooms on the left and right. We couldn't see the end of the hallway, it was just too long. Each of us wanted to catch a glimpse of the inside. Then, one of my friends said, "There's a small light at the end of the hallway." That light wasn't there when I looked through the peephole, so I pushed him aside and took another look. What I saw sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just a small light. It looked more like a flashlight pointed directly at me, and behind it was the silhouette of a person. I stepped back and said, "There's someone in there." At that very moment, something or someone knocked on the door from inside the bunker. That was the moment we panicked, started screaming, and ran. I was so scared that I ran straight home and locked the door behind me. The next day at school, my friends and I talked about what happened. We came to the conclusion that some older kids had probably played a prank on us. A week later, we decided to go back to the same bunker. But when we arrived, we saw that the welded connection, which should have kept the door locked, was still rusty and unbroken. We just left without saying a word to each other. It was impossible for anyone to have opened that door before us, and it was the only entrance. I still live in the same region, but since then, I have never visited the bunker again. Story 2. Years ago, I fell asleep on my mother's living room sofa. She was already in bed, but my brother was out somewhere. In the middle of the night, I woke up to see someone standing over me, covering me with a blanket. It looked like a man wearing a bandana. I assumed it was my brother, though I thought it was odd for him to be wearing that. The next morning, I asked him about it. He said he hadn't even come into the living room when he got home, and it definitely wasn't him who covered me up. My mother also denied doing it, and no one else was in the house that night. I didn't really find it creepy until a while later, when one of my aunts stayed at my mum's house and reported the exact same thing happening to her. Apparently, there was a ghost in that house that liked to make sure people were tucked in when they fell asleep on the sofa. Could be worse. Story 3. My mother-in-law was a funny and cool woman. She and my wife were really close, but sadly, she passed away when our son was about 4 months old. Flash forward a few years. We lived in a 1930s era craftsman house in Pasadena, CA, and our son was about 3 at the time. One night, I was giving him a bath when he suddenly started looking over my shoulder, not at random stuff, but at something specific. A moment passed, and he asked me, "Why does Grandma call Mummy a funny name?" I froze. Confused, I asked what he meant, thinking he was talking about my mum. He then said, "Why does Grandma call Mummy Baba?" That threw me completely. My wife and I never used that nickname, ever. It was just something her mum had called her since she was a baby. I asked him where he had heard that. His reply, "The farmer told me." I asked him who the farmer was, and he simply said, "My friend." Later that night, I told my wife about the whole conversation, and she was in tears when I got to the part about the nickname. We both knew there was no way he could have known it. We just marveled at the strangeness of it all. Flash forward to the next weekend. My son was playing in his room while my wife was at work retail, and I was home. I worked Monday to Friday. I started hearing him talking like he was having a full-blown conversation. He was saying things like, yes, no, I don't know that, and then laughing. Curious, I walked into his room and asked him what he was doing. He said, playing. I asked, with who? His response, the farmer. At this point, I'm already starting to think about The Exorcist and Captain Howdy. It was unsettling. I asked him where the farmer was. He said, he left when you came in. What the hell? When my wife got home, I told her about the conversation, and now she was just as weirded out as I was. We didn't know what to do, but figured if it happened again, we'd take action. A few days later, in the middle of the night, we overheard our son talking in his room. We listened as he said, "Grandma says you and I can't be friends anymore." That was it. My wife and I rushed to check on him, both of us feeling completely unsettled. He was just sitting up in bed. I asked if he was okay, and he said, yeah. Grandma says I can't play with the farmer anymore. And just like that, he never mentioned the farmer again. Not once. He's 13 now and doesn't remember any of it. But we sure do. Story 4. I was at a friend's house one night and ended up passing out on the couch. After waking up a bit later, I realized it was time for me to head home since I had work in the morning. I got up, noticed the light was on in my buddy's room, but his door was shut. As I walked by, I called out, "Hey, I'm leaving. I got to work tomorrow." He replied, "Yup, see ya." I went to the fridge, grabbed my drink, and on my way out, I passed his door again and said, "Later, dude." He replied, "Yup." But something about it didn't seem right. It didn't sound quite like him. So, feeling uneasy, I opened the door to his room, and no one was there. The room was empty. In fact, the entire house was empty. I started to freak out. I bolted outside and noticed his truck was gone. Panicking, I called him on his cell, and he told me he had left for McDonald's about 15 minutes earlier. I waited outside until he got home, and when I told him what happened, he didn't seem too surprised. That's when he told me the story. A kid who used to live in the house years ago had hung himself in the attic. Ever since my friend moved in, he'd noticed strange things happening, like voices and weird feelings. Later, this was confirmed by the neighbor, the kid's older brother. Since then, just about anyone who visits my friend's house has some sort of strange experience. My buddy has dealt with it for years. He told me that whenever it starts getting too weird, he just yells out, "Leave me alone," and the creepy vibes stop for a while. But they always come back. Story 5. I have 2 stories to share. When my son was about 6 months old, I had a dream that we were at my grandparents' house. In the dream, my grandfather was holding my son and crying while I sat talking to my grandmother. I told her, "I wish you and Papa Joe were still alive to see him," and she replied, "Don't worry, we see him." I didn't think much of it until about 5 years later, when I was talking to my sister and mentioned the dream. She got quiet and asked, "Was Papa Joe holding your son while he rocked in his chair? And did Grandma tell you they were watching you?" I froze, surprised, and said yes. I asked how she knew, and she told me, "I had the same dream when my son was 6 months old." More recently, when my son was 20, he was driving home late one night from work. As he drove, he heard my mother's voice, who had passed away 2 years earlier, clearly say, "Jonathan, stop the car." Startled, he instinctively hit the brakes, and just as he did, 3 deer ran right in front of him. Had he not stopped, he would have hit them. Story 6. When I was in high school, a group of friends and I participated in an archaeological dig at a Roman fort in South Shields, UK. It was my first time outside the US, so we took the opportunity to travel up to Edinburgh for some sightseeing. We had a great time during the day, but that evening, while walking back to our hotel after drinks, something strange happened. A group of 2 women and 1 man approached us on the street. For reasons I couldn't explain, I was suddenly hit with a wave of anxiety. As they got closer, we all noticed how strikingly beautiful and almost unnaturally perfect they were. Bright blue eyes, perfect hair, and wearing impeccably fitted all-black clothing. They had this air of arrogance and power that made them stand out even more. They stopped us, asking what we were doing in town. We answered vaguely, feeling uncomfortable. Then, someone in our group mentioned that we were heading to London the next day. One of the women looked directly at us and said, "You should avoid the tube and buses. It would be best to get out of the country as soon as possible." We were all pretty creeped out by the encounter, but we made it back to our hotel. The next morning, we took an early flight back to London and decided to take a cab to our hotel instead of using public transport. Later that day, the London tube bombings happened. Fast forward 6 years. I was visiting my girlfriend, who was studying for her master's degree at the University of Edinburgh. We were at a pub when I saw the same woman and man from that night. She approached me and said, "You were right to take my advice." To this day, it's the most spine-chilling event I've ever experienced, and I doubt I'll ever forget it. Story 7. My mom, who was epileptic, had a seizure in her sleep one night. She got tangled up in her blankets and suffocated. Thankfully, the paramedics were able to get her breathing again and rushed her to the hospital in an ambulance. This all happened very early in the morning, around 4:30 a.m. My family tasked me with calling relatives to let them know what had happened. The first person I needed to call was my grandmother, my mum's mother. Just as I was about to pick up the phone, it rang. It was my grandmother. It was about 5:30 a.m. for me, but only 2:30 a.m. in her time zone. She told me that she had seen my mother bathed in golden light, and they had spoken. She said that my mother had passed away, but was going to a better place. At that moment, I didn't know that my mum was going to die. My father was at the hospital with her, and even the doctors hadn't realized yet that she was brain dead. But somehow, my grandmother knew, and she reached out to me before I even had the chance to call her. It was incredibly eerie, and I've never forgotten it. Story 8. There was a woman named Annie, a friend of my mum's, and after college, I stayed with her for a few months. I worked the second shift, so I'd usually be up late watching TV after everyone else had gone to bed. One night, Annie walked into the living room, half asleep. I asked her, "What's going on, Annie?" And she said, "My grandmother just called." Confused, I told her, "No one's called Annie." But she insisted that her grandmother had called to say goodbye, and now she wanted to phone her family to check on her. I brushed it off, thinking she must have been dreaming, and told her it was just a dream. "Don't wake up your family in the middle of the night. Call them in the morning." Annie agreed and went back to bed. About an hour later, as I was getting into bed myself, the phone actually rang. It was Anna's family, calling to let her know that her grandmother had passed away about an hour earlier. Her grandmother was old, but not sick or on the verge of death. The next day, Annie didn't remember the conversation at all, and we never spoke about it again. For years, I thought about it, and wasn't sure if it was a ghost story or just an eerie coincidence. Being skeptical, I chalked it up to coincidence, and only shared the story when people were telling ghost stories for fun. Then, about a decade later, Annie passed away unexpectedly. At her funeral, her brother gave the eulogy. In it, he shared this story. When Annie was around 4 years old, her great-grandmother died. The family had gathered at the house, and at some point, they realized little Annie had disappeared. After a quick search, they found her in a bedroom, rolling on the floor laughing. When they asked, "What's so funny, Annie?" she replied, "Great-grandma was tickling me. She came to say goodbye." Story 9. I moved into my current home about 3 years ago. There's nothing overtly creepy about it, but something strange happens here that we haven't been able to explain. Our house is only about 100 yards away from a local church with a bell tower. Every winter, when it gets dark around 6 p.m., the church bells chime 6 times, 6 single chimes, one after the other. The thing is, every time the bells ring, a distinct smell overtakes our home for about 30 seconds. It's not a smell I can easily describe, sweet, yet sour, dark but cold, wet yet dry. It's an odd mix that doesn't remind me of anything specific. I mentioned winter because it only seems to happen when it's dark at 6 p.m., so mostly during the winter months. My girlfriend, our dog, and I have gotten used to it by now. It's just become a part of our daily routine when the season changes. At first, we tried to figure out what it could be. We researched the history of the house, but didn't find anything out of the ordinary. We even asked our landlord, but he said he'd never noticed anything, though he's never actually lived here himself. Eventually, we let it go when nothing unusual came up. Then, about 4 months ago, our neighbor, an older, quiet man who mostly kept to himself, passed away. His daughter came by to clear out his house, and while we were chatting, she mentioned something that stopped me in my tracks. She told me that the previous tenant in my house was also an elderly widower. He used to spend his summers away with his son, but returned to the house each winter. Every day at 6 p.m., when the church bells chimed, he and our late neighbor would cook dinner together. Apparently, they were both a little wild with their cooking experiments, and you could smell their concoctions all the way down the street. It gave me chills to realize that the strange smell that fills our house at 6 p.m. could be a remnant of their old routine ritual that echoes through the seasons, just like the chimes of the bell tower. Story 10. Many years ago, when I was 14, I stayed overnight at a friend's house with 3 other friends. We'd all grown up together, except one, a cousin of the kid who lived there, whom we had just met for the first time. His older sister, who was 16 at the time, was the babysitter while the parents were out for the evening. She thought it'd be fun to scare us by pulling out a Ouija board she found in a cupboard. Back then, you could buy Ouija boards as a board game from your local toy store, so none of us thought much of it at first. We all gathered around as she asked questions, using the board like a lie detector, directing them to each of us in turn. There were nervous giggles, but also a growing unease, like we were on the edge of discovering something beyond our control. Things took a creepy turn when the sister asked, "If anybody is here, please show yourself." After a brief pause, a framed picture fell off the wall and hit the floor. We all freaked out, naturally. She calmed us down, insisting we return to the board because we had to help whoever knocked the picture down. Reluctantly, we agreed. The atmosphere shifted. The planchette, which had been moving slowly and awkwardly before, now glided smoothly and quickly. The questions started to flow. Are you in the room? Yes. Are you a man? No. Do you need help? No. What's your name? It spelled out SRH. We were frozen in place, but still, we pressed on. We asked, "Tell us a secret." The board spelled out FLAPSEOIN. Someone rushed off to grab a coin from the kitchen, a chunky 1OP coin from the old days. They tossed it high into the air. We watched it spin, but as it fell, it didn't behave like a coin should. Instead of bouncing or rocking, it came down slowly, perfectly, landing on its edge. It just stood there on the table, as if an invisible hand had gently placed it upright. We were stunned into silence, but the planchette wasn't done. It began moving again, spelling out random letters at first, which we quickly realized were initials' full names, including middle names. The thing is, one of our friends had 3 middle names, a family tradition that not all of us knew. Aside from him, his sister, and his cousin. No one knew the older sister's full name either, and we had just met the cousin that night. Yet the board correctly spelled out every single person's initials. Then, the board spelled out 3 final words. "Children, stop now." We were terrified. It took me weeks to sleep properly after that night. None of us told our parents, and over the years, it became our shared secret. Even now, I still can't rationalize what happened. It was freaky as hell. Story 11. I'm usually super skeptical, but my friend is really into ghost hunting. I tag along sometimes just for fun, since it's such a different experience, and usually, it's just silly and nothing happens. Except for this one time, when we were going over the evidence. I helped with a lot of his sound work, and I was with him during this particular investigation. We were reviewing the audio, and at one point, he noticed something that sounded like a piano playing faintly in the background. Curious, I loaded it into Goldwave and cleaned up the audio. As I worked on it, the sound became clearer. It faded in slowly, played clearly for a few seconds, and then faded out. It wasn't just some distant noise, it was unmistakably the sound of a piano. Here's the thing, there was no piano in the house. There was no power in the house either, and we were in the middle of nowhere. The nearest neighbor was about a mile away, and there was no access to any radio signals. What's even stranger is that none of us heard the piano when it was playing. It only showed up in the recording. That gave me serious chills, because there was absolutely no logical explanation for it. We also captured some other weird noises and unexplainable pictures, but nothing came close to the magnitude of that piano clip. I think I still have the recording on my computer, and if I can find it, I'll post it later. It's not a creepy sound on its own, but given the context, it's eerie as hell. Story 12. My grandmother had a large window in her family room that looked out onto her backyard. The yard was a decent size, backed by fields and a wooded area. Deer would visit regularly, stopping by for the salt lick she put out and occasionally stealing pears from the trees. It was a common sight to see several deer wandering through whenever we visited, and my grandmother loved to sit in her chair and watch them. As she grew older, my grandmother developed untreatable cancer. She eventually went from sitting in her chair to lying on the couch, still able to enjoy watching the deer through the window. When the time came to move her to hospice, it was incredibly emotional for my family. My father, uncle, and sister were there to help, and as they were doing a final walk through her house, her home of 60 years, they passed through the family room and noticed something strange. There were 15 to 20 deer in the backyard, but instead of wandering around like they usually did, they were all sitting down, facing the house. The deer stayed there, quietly looking at the house as my family stood at the window, staring back. My father, uncle, and sister all swear by what they saw. Normally, the deer would pass through and move on within minutes, but this time they lingered. Maybe it was just a coincidence or a strange weather day, but I like to think those deer gathered to say goodbye to a longtime friend. Story 13. I'm a skeptic. I've always been the kind of person who believes only in what I can see or experience. Even as a kid, I didn't believe in Santa Claus. So, naturally, I've never put much stock in the paranormal. But there are a few moments in my life that I still can't explain. When I was very young, between 1.5 and 3 years old, Di was often sick and quiet. My parents moved us from Alaska to Oregon to be closer to family for help. We rented a few different houses, all pretty old and run down. One house, in particular, felt off. It was old, creaky, and even the landlord had mental health issues. My parents and grandparents could feel it too. The atmosphere was heavy, and I could sense it, even as a kid. I started saying strange things, like telling my parents there were skeletons in my closet watching me. Once, when my grandma was alone with me, I simply said, "Man with gun." We weren't in a place where that would have been normal, and I'd never said anything like that before or after living in that house. The weirdest thing happened right before we moved out. Someone or several people broke into the house. They didn't steal anything, or even touch anything valuable. Instead, They smeared human feces and urine in strange patterns all over the walls and floors. Needless to say, we moved out immediately after that. The next house we moved into brought its own strange experiences. The most terrifying moment of my life happened there when I was about 6 or 7. I was waking up one morning, still groggy, but aware of my surroundings. I saw my bedroom door open and assumed it was my dad coming to wake me up. I felt a light pressure on my legs, as if someone was shaking me gently. I decided to pretend I was still asleep, being a stubborn kid. Then, the shaking stopped. A moment later, I felt a breeze under my blanket, like someone had lifted it by my feet. Suddenly, 2 large hands grabbed my legs hard and started pulling me off the bed. At first, I thought it was my dad messing with me, but these hands felt angry, and I quickly became terrified. I tried to claw at my bed, trying to get a grip, but the hands kept pulling. After about 30 to 60 seconds of struggling, they let go. I bolted out of my room, ran to the kitchen, and found both of my parents there, calmly making breakfast. Between sobs, I asked my dad why he had done that, why he had scared me so badly. He just looked at me, completely baffled, and said, "I haven't been in your room this morning. Are you okay?" It was the most confused and scared I've ever been. Not everything strange has been scary though. My little brother was born about 4 years after me, and by then, we had moved into a new house, which we still live in today. We bought it from a sweet old widow, we'll call her Trudy, who was very fond of my parents. She went out of her way to make sure they got the house, doing everything she could to dissuade other buyers. She was lonely, with no family nearby and only her cats for company, so she liked helping out a young family. A couple of years after we moved in, Trudy passed away. My little brother, who had never met her, was 2 or 3 years old at the time. One night, after being put to bed, he ran excitedly out of his room and told my parents. Grandma Trudy came to visit me, and she says hi. Story 14. I'm sure there are people who've had creepier experiences than me, but I'll share mine anyway. This happened in my father's old house. It was a massive place with 5 bedrooms, sitting on a large piece of land. The house was incredibly secluded. You couldn't see it from the road or the nearby park, and it was surrounded by bushland. It was winter at the time, so all the windows were closed, and we didn't have heaters running in the house. It was around 10 p.m., and I was the last one awake, getting ready to go to bed. After doing my usual routine, I laid down and tried to fall asleep. I'd been in bed for about 10 minutes when I felt a strange pressure at the foot of my bed. At first, I thought it was just my body entering the early stages of sleep, so I brushed it off. But then the pressure started moving not directly on my legs, but around and between them. That's when I began to panic. Like most people, I froze in fear, hoping whatever was happening would just go away. For about 5 more minutes, the pressure continued before it suddenly lifted. My heart was racing, and I tried to calm myself down. I sat up, hoping to shake off the adrenaline, when suddenly I felt a hand press against my face. Immediately after, a strong gust of air blew my hair back, as if someone had exhaled forcefully right in front of me. I freaked out completely and ended up sleeping on my dad's floor that night. We ended up moving not long after, because my stepmother started having strange experiences too. I'm not saying what happened was paranormal, but it's something I still can't explain. I've experienced sleep paralysis a few times, and I'm certain this wasn't that. It was unsettling, but not the same level of terror that comes with sleep paralysis. Story 15. I was in an ambulance, being transferred from a small provincial hospital to a larger one in the capital. I had a severe case of pneumonia that wasn't responding to the weak oral antibiotics they had been giving me. In the ambulance, I could barely breathe due to what later turned out to be 750 grams of fluid in my lungs. The ambulance jolted along, and I was gasping for air when suddenly, I felt a severe blow, like something had kicked me right out of my body. I've read about near-death experiences where people describe seeing a tunnel or a light, but that wasn't my experience. It was just this forceful, violent blow that threw me out of my body. I remember looking at myself from the side and seeing a nurse trying to put a breathing mask on me. At first, I thought something had happened to my vision. I was seeing everything in 2D, almost like I was watching a movie, and in almost black and white. The colors were dull, like shades of grey, with just hints of other hues. I know it sounds strange there, I was, looking at myself from the outside, but my main concern was my eyesight. I was 14 at the time, panicked, and not thinking straight. I remember freaking out about my vision, and that's when I thought about my mother. In an instant, I was looking at her. She was traveling in a car with my father and uncle, following the ambulance on the way to the capital. The car belonged to my uncle. I tried to talk to her, telling her that something was wrong with my eyes and that I couldn't see properly. Of course, she didn't hear me. They were busy talking angry, cursing the doctors at the provincial hospital for their incompetence. They were discussing how the doctors had tried to get them to sign some papers after the ambulance left and how they had refused. They also talked about how they had arranged for me to be admitted to the department led by a highly competent doctor with a unique name associate, Professor Koyendeliev. I distinctly remembered this strange name. At that moment, I realized how serious the situation was. I wasn't supposed to be there. Panic hit me hard, and I started thinking about my friends, my school, and the girl I liked. As soon as a thought about someone became sharp enough, I was instantly there with them, as if standing next to them. But the panic kept growing, and I started jumping from place to place, memory to memory, faster and faster, until everything became a chaotic kaleidoscope of people and places. Suddenly, it all stopped when an old lady appeared. She had pure white hair, like snow, not the grayish colors of everything else I was seeing. She took my hand and made me look at her, telling me to calm down. She repeated it over and over, and somehow I started to feel more in control. The chaotic jumping stopped. Then she explained that I was going to fall asleep soon, and when I woke up, I'd be in the hospital. She told me the doctors would give me injections, some of them painful, but I needed to be brave and endure it. My condition would improve, but in 2 months, the doctors would suggest surgery. She insisted repeatedly that when I woke up, I had to tell my mother to refuse the surgery. She said if they performed the surgery, I would die. She stressed this several times and made me promise I would tell my mother as soon as I woke up. She also mentioned that if I behaved, my uncle would bring me lots of delicious chocolates in the hospital. When I woke up in the emergency room, I immediately told my mother everything. She was shocked, especially when I described the conversation she had in the car and mentioned the strange name of the doctor. Her eyes went wide as I frantically told her to refuse any surgery. At the time, no one had even mentioned surgery, but I kept insisting. She tried to calm me down, reassuring me that everything would be fine and that no surgery was planned. I slept a lot in the hospital and was very weak. The doctors drained the fluids from my lungs using long, thick needles that they inserted through my back. It was incredibly painful, just as the old lady had said. As Christmas passed, they gave me stronger antibiotics, and I began to recover. But 45 days later, they found a spot on my left lung that wouldn't heal. 2 months later, it was still there, the same size, and they began pushing for surgery. My mother initially resisted, but over time, as more doctors insisted, she finally gave in and signed the papers. This delayed the surgery for a few weeks. Then, just before the surgery, they took one final X-ray to check the size of the spot and it was gone. The surgery was cancelled. It turned out my mother had lied to me all along, telling me there would be no surgery while secretly preparing for it. I only found out later what had really happened. My mother also told me how, despite everything, my usually stingy uncle brought me chocolate after chocolate during my hospital stay. This was in Bulgaria, a socialist country at the time, where such chocolates were rare and expensive. My uncle, who was notoriously frugal, worked as a truck driver, transporting goods internationally, and he'd bought the chocolates abroad. My mother said this strange generosity from him was what finally convinced her to resist signing the surgery papers for as long as she did. I have other strange memories from that time, but I've decided not to share them because I'm not sure how reliable they are. These memories are the ones I've been able to verify with my family. Years later, I had my parents and uncle recount what they remembered, and I recorded their words. This is the part of the story that I believe to be true. For the record, I'm not religious, nor are my family members. We didn't become religious after this incident either. That is all for today. If you have enjoyed this video, do like and subscribe, and let me know below of your thoughts. If you want to help in my dad's fundraiser, I would truly appreciate it. Hope you have an absolutely amazing day. You can also check my other videos on screen.